Okay, and we're live. This is Deacon Joseph Swaden doing the Orthodox Apologetics Channel's live show as we usually do. I'm trying to get back into that habit. And basically, the topic for today, I don't see Bishop Enoch yet, and that's okay. The topic was why you should become Western Rite. It was actually really more of it's actually really more of a thought experiment than anything else. I spend a lot of time on things like Twitter. And one of the things that people, dislike about us, some people dislike about us, is probably the whole true Orthodox thing. But probably one thing that makes us even more despicable in the eyes of the Orthodox internet would be the use of Western rites. Now, keep in mind, of course, the view that people have on Western rites is variable depending on whether or not we're talking about the same things. For the most part, the things that I find agreeable and that people find agreeable, usually they find a traditional Western rite agreeable, but they don't like the people it's coming from. So you find yourself in a weird position of where people have to, if they don't hate you for one reason, they hate you for another. But in any case, I was expecting Bishop Enoch, and he's not here. And since I don't see him, what I'm going to do until then is I've been playing with the StreamYard interface. One thing that I learned from watching Craig Trulia's and Father John Whiteford's excellent episode was most recent episode was that you can put things in the StreamYard screen. Now, this is something that I have been curious about because that would literally mean I could review episodes. You could actually interrupt. You could just comment and make your own comments on episodes as they're playing. So this is something that I've thought of for a while because I've actually liked the idea of just answering on the fly instead of having to write a whole response. But in any case, I just got a message from Vladika Enoch that he will be here shortly, so we can talk about the thought experiment of this week's episode. This is an open discussion, so if you have questions, comments, concerns, you want to come on the show and yell at us, we're going to allow it. Hello, I see that Rural English says hello, Deacon. So hello, just saying hi there to people who are coming in. So as we continue on, as I said, this is going to be it should be an interesting broadcast, and I'm curious to see how this picture on picture thing works. Yesterday, if for those who were not following same Twitter or our group on Facebook, hi Sean. Sean says hello, and we just say howdy there, and um we basically I was talking to Drew of the Atheist Reformation about Orthodoxy, and I asked my usual question, even though it was kind of in an offhand manner, about why he wouldn't become Orthodox. And so it was worth in my opinion, the time to do it. I think that in many cases you can't really talk to atheists because they are so emotionally invested. Drew's a little bit of a different story, so I hope for the best for him. But in any case, what we're doing here is, as I said, this is going to be one of these episodes where, probably everyone will get mad, but that's kind of why we want everyone's input. So anyone who wants to come in and say something, I mean, we're more than happy to have a discussion on the matter. And so, let's see here. Basically, what I'm doing now is, we're just waiting for Bishop Enoch for a minute. So, it's I know I'm gonna create a banner. I'm gonna have some fun with this. I'm gonna just create a quick banner, and it's just gonna say technical difficulties. And so, whenever I want to just do something like that, let's see here. Okay, so we had a question already, and it's about Western Rite. Hold on. Benedicta.
Benedicite, can you hear me?
Uh, yes, you're on live. So.
Okay.
Hold on a moment. Rambles came with a question. It says, "Does your jurisdiction use any post-schism devotions such as Sacred Heart, Stations of the Cross, etc.?" No, those are Roman Catholic innovations. I would not even go so far as to say it's a jurisdictional issue as it is a practical issue. And what I mean by that is, if you're using stuff like that, you have to question the motivation as to why. And most of the time, it's because of some sort of romantic obsession with one's Roman Catholic or Anglican past. It's not necessary, but at the same time, one thing that I do want to make clear is once you take out things like the Sacred Hearts and Stations of the Cross and just use the ancient Western Rite, it still doesn't look Eastern. It looks Western, all right. So I do want to make that totally clear. I don't know, Vladika, did you have anything you wanted to add on that particular point?
No.
Okay.
That's your answer is correct.
Yeah. So, in any case, I hope that answers that question, Rambles, and so we'll go to continue on. Um, but what I was saying, Vladika, was that I've discovered that there's this, uh, I guess, this picture-in-picture format that exists on this StreamYard thing. So we can actually Benedicite, excuse me. There's a picture-in-picture thing on this StreamYard that allows you to actually not just you could actually put on a video live inside the video. So we could literally just review other videos if we felt like it, put them on pause, and just start answering them. So I think that that's an interesting feature, and I'd like to make more use of it in the future. But other than that, I was basically explaining that this episode is kind of a thought experiment. And what I mean by that is, generally, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, people, if they don't like us for being true Orthodox, they really don't like us for being Western Rite. So I wanted to kind of touch into what's the purpose, the positive purpose of even being Western Rite. Like, why don't we just become Greeks?
Well, we can't become. How do you change your ethnicity?
Okay, well, liturgically Greek.
Oh, well, I all I can say is I venerate my saints, who are actually many of these saints who were Saxon saints are my, in fact, physical ancestors, or under those saints, and part of that veneration is I have to respect the liturgical rite that they used. I don't know if that helps any bit of the answer, but I mean I can't see how one could abstractly say you venerate the saints, but at the same time condemn what they were liturgically using. Maybe you can be, if you want to flush it out more, Father Joseph.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm looking for here, and I guess maybe it's to just annoy the people on Twitter, but really, I'd like to make the proactive case for why we should use Western rites. I find that we're generally in a defensive posture when it comes to discussing the matter. It's like we have to explain ourselves. And so
you give your answer to the question, and then I'll respond. How about you do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that from even a vestigial standpoint, there is so much in the life of a Westerner, if they are a pious Westerner of a formerly traditional church, that there are aspects of the Western Rite that come into play in terms of even our language, even the terms matins and evensong. But the point is that it goes far deeper than that. Um, Even musically, the Gregorian chant remains part of the Lutheran tradition, the Roman Catholic tradition, the Anglican tradition. Okay, was that the dog?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the dogs are barking.
That's okay. No problem. I just thought you really didn't like that answer.
No.
But in any case,
well, there are fragmentary. See, obviously we can't endorse those the wrong things about those false traditions like papism, Lutheranism. But there's an interesting point here: is why is it that when you look before the Great Schism, and this may be kind of forgive me for like a mystical answer, or anyway, but notice that it's very difficult to find complete manuscripts of, let's say, the liturgy of Saint John Chrysostom or Saint Basil. You find the earliest complete liturgical text, and it's not really complete, but the earliest text that has, let's say, the anaphora of Saint Chrysostom and the anaphora of St. Basil, and like the secret prayers, but none of the rubrics, none of the litanies, and a lot of other stuff, is around the year 800 AD. Okay. Now that, of course, doesn't mean it's not an ancient text, obviously. But this is something I and a few other people have discussed, that when you look for, let's say, Byzantine liturgical manuscripts, there aren't as many that predate, let's say, the year 1050 or 1000. You have them, but when you compare that to, let's say, 5,000 Roman Rite sacramentaries from as early as the 600s to as late as 1050, when you compare that to the hundreds of antiphonarious graduals, I mean, literally, if you were to probably add it up, 10, 20,000 complete manuscripts or near complete manuscripts, massive amounts of manuscripts of commentaries, whereas Byzantium, before that, we don't really have a lot. And that's, in fact, what played into the old believer system, by the way, believe it or not. They couldn't really go back before a certain date to figure out who was right about what. So the reason I called it a mystical answer is almost it was seeming that God was preserving these pre-schism texts in such massive abundance that no other rite has ever been so well documented. So that when, after the apostasy and the Hildebrandian takeover, when Westerners would finally begin coming back to Orthodoxy, there would be so much material for them. So much material, commentaries on the liturgies, multiple manuscripts of the same ordo, same ordinings for all the sacraments, that it would, if anybody was able just to look at a few of them, they could immediately begin if they were Orthodox and they had, they were priests and had permission, they could immediately begin celebrating the ancient Orthodox Western Rite without any problem. I don't know if that.
No, I think that was a pretty solid answer. Rambles, I'm going to skip your first question about Rochor and Antioch's Western Rites because it's a little complicated, but I really do want to get to like real arguments and discussion.
But another point to make would be that, like you say, even the fragmentary, messed up stuff that does exist in the post-schism period, and it got worse as time went on, obviously.
Yeah.
That, for example, you can say that this has this residual echo in the. I mean, even I grew up in a kind of a conservative, Protestant environment in the South, in the rural South in North Carolina. It was kind of Methodists and Presbyterians, that kind of stuff. But I could go into some of these churches, and you would see things like stained glass windows, or like, let's say, kind of like hanging lamps. Okay.
Yeah.
You could see a cross on a communion table, although we didn't really know what it meant with candles and stuff. We thought it was just a regular communion table. Now that's very, very minor type stuff, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But stained glass windows go back before the schism by 200 or 300 years. We know that stained glass was used in St. Bede's Monastery, all right, in the late 600s and early 700s. That was an ancient art, an ancient form of in fact, hanging lamps, obviously, that's, you don't have to say much about that. Cross or candles on a table. So what was it that kind of a recessed, kind of choir area? What was it that, what I'm just saying, there was something there that goes back into their mind. Now, the problem obviously is that evangelical Protestantism had destroyed any kind of concept of attaching to that in many people's minds, but there's something to work on there, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Now you could equally argue, well, you could say someone could be familiar with, Byzantium's liturgical customs through that, in the sense that there's this general kind of vibe, but this general, kind of echo atmosphere there. But it gets stronger in other groups. For example, you go to, traditionalist Anglicans, traditionalist Roman Catholics. Now, that's not to endorse a lot of what they do liturgically, because a lot of that is, in fact, believe it or not, only of the last 300 years. Yeah. Especially traditionalist Roman Catholics. I mean, things like the Sacred Heart. I mean, that's Immaculate Heart of Mary. That's really the past 300 years.
150, 200 years ago.
And even things, for example, in the Tridentine Rite, like when they push the altar and they don't cense around the altar because they push it all the way against the east wall and the chancel. If you look into even the 1580s, some of the old Tridentine ordos from the 1580s and 90s, even up to the 20th century, there were technical rubrics for censing around the altar. All right. Now, it was hardly, if ever, done, but they kind of still existed there. So, obviously, there's the heresy of papism. There are numerous problems there, but it wasn't so degraded that you could not. I could look at, let's say, the Tridentine Missal, and if I removed all the heretical feasts and the feast for heretical saints, so-called saints, and I made a few emendations and say adding the offertory verses and such, it would be substantially the same as what was done prior to the schism.
Right.
Now there is a question about, let's say, the ethos in which, let's say, in Tridentinism, it became so obsessed with mechanism and legalism, and how they did their so-called masses and such. That's something that developed not just into the medieval period. It's actually something that came out after the medieval period. And as you get into the, kind of the Counter-Reformation and all the other stuff, when the Jesuits and others kind of, and the Franciscans, and a few other groups kind of imposed this even on the post-schism West, to the extent that, for example, the Jesuits were well known for being the first religious order in the post-schism, heretical schismatic West that actually did not have any obligation to publicly sing the divine office, for example. Okay? And that, as a result of the power of the Jesuits, that deformed massively the post-Reformation papist, even the Roman papist Rite material that was not unobjectionable. Everything became more centered on the concept of what we call low mass. And as we've discovered, I remember a conversation we had, Father Joseph, that even in, let's say, France, up into the Revolution, when they even did their so-called low masses, they were actually monotone chanted.
Yeah.
And so it's really the low mass as a spoken, whispered service seems to have been something that's the Jesuits and a few others actually finally got to be introduced only in the 1700s everywhere, and then in many other places. So you're seeing this kind of gradual degradation of what was left from the tradition before that. Now, the positive case is that that degradation still held much tradition, even if it's outside the church, that was still objectively from the saints. All right, the Roman canon of the Mass, for example, the 99% of the collects, secrets, post-communions, the prefaces, things like that. All right, and whose heritage is that? It's my heritage. It's your heritage. It's the heritage of everyone who was born from the peoples of Europe. And yeah. I would even go further. It's become the heritage by a sort of adoption of people even outside of Europe, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, like in Latin America and Asia.
Exactly. And so that we can say, look, these were things once done by saints, and now they're still now we are doing them again. All right.
Well, that's actually what that relates to. That
now that doesn't mean I'm not saying you can't be Byzantine Rite and venerate, let's say, Saint Dunstan. I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing you can't condemn what Saint Dunstan did liturgically.
Okay. Well, I'm going to get to Ramble's question, which is a very popular argument against the Western Rite. It's the argument of it having no living or tradition or links like the East does. How would you respond to this argument? I mean, in the first place, the canons don't, and I look at the canons for that because you can kind of see something. The canons don't envision sort of ritual uniformity unless it's a matter of doctrine being challenged. When a see falls to heresy and it gets reclaimed by the Orthodox, there's nothing that says anything about what kind of rite should be used or anything. It's simply the holder of the see, if he's undisputed for a number of years, then takes that see back for the Orthodox. If he's using a Western Rite, that is largely irrelevant to the question, because then you have a living tradition. If you have somebody using a Western Rite and a Western see, it's already there. So from my perspective, the concept of it having no living tradition or links has been dead for 100 years. That it doesn't make sense to me, because you have Bishop Garad Pravdek, who was a martyr, and you have the tradition that goes back all the way when Overbeck first petitioned to the Russian Synod. After that, you no longer have St. John Maximovich is another.
He was continuing the concept.
Right. He was not beginning the concept, he was continuing it. So the point is, we're talking about 120 years. It doesn't make sense anymore. It might have been a great argument in 1897, but it's not a good argument in 2020.
And 2 points. One, a liturgy does not die. The people who celebrate it may be killed, okay? But the liturgy itself is something, a work of God and the saints, and that cannot be killed, okay?
Exactly.
A second point, if you look at, let's say, the last great encyclical of the Ecumenical Patriarchate before basically its fall in 1920. But the last, I mean, I'd say the one condemning name worship was great too, but the last kind of universally great, forgive me for that lack of a word, was the 1895 encyclical of Patriarch Anthimus, in which he replied to Leo the 13th, so-called Leo the 13th encyclical on the supposed reunion with the papacy. And in it, if you look in, I just put the link up. If you look in section 5. The Ecumenical Patriarch Anthimus and his synod actually talk about the issue, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And here's what they say. It says, but however that may be, for the practical realization of the pious longing for the union of the churches, a common principle and basis must be settled for all. First of all, and there can be no other such safe common principle and basis other than the teaching of the gospel and of the 7 holy ecumenical councils. Reverting then to that teaching which was common to the churches of the East and of the West and to the separation, we ought with a sincere desire to know the truth, to search what the one holy Catholic and Orthodox Apostolic Church of Christ, being then of the same body throughout the East and the West, believed, and to hold this fact entire and true. Okay, stop there for a second. So what is he saying? If people want to unite with Orthodoxy, what do they have to do? They have to hold Orthodoxy. And you can do that by looking at what was held by the commonly professed by the fathers and the 7 holy ecumenical councils. And if you do that, guess what, Father Joseph? It leads you to Orthodoxy. There's no question. So what does Patriarch Anthimus and his bishops say next? They say, quote, but whatsoever has in latter times been added or taken away, everyone has a sacred and indispensable duty, if he sincerely seeks for the glory of God more than of his own glory, that in the spirit of piety he should correct it, considering that by arrogantly continuing the perversion of the truth, he is liable to a heavy account before the impartial judgment seat of Christ. Okay. Then, he says, in saying this, we do not at all refer to the differences regarding the ritual of the sacred services and the hymns, or the sacred vestments and the like, which matters, even though they still vary, as they did of old, do not in the least injure the substance and unity of faith. But we refer to those essential differences which have reference to the divinely transmitted doctrines of the faith and the divinely instituted canonical constitution of the administration of the churches. In cases where the thing disregarded is not the faith, says also St. Photius, and it is no falling away from the general and Catholic decree, different rites and customs being observed among different people, a man who knows how to judge rightly would decide that neither do those who observe them act wrongly, nor do those who have not received them break the law. And that's from St. Photius. And I think St. Photius was actually answering a question about the Armenians. If I go down, it says, what is it, the comment? I think that may be St. Photius' epistle, maybe to the Armenians or something, to someone who was asking about Armenians wanting to come back. Or it could have been the question. Remember, there was actually interesting discussion at the what's oftentimes referred to as the 8th Ecumenical Council in 879, in which some of the bishops and the Eastern bishops were saying, well, what about some of the things that the Latins are doing that, and these were some things that even St. Photius had disagreed with, and I would even disagree with and such. For example, reserving confirmation to the bishop alone. And St. Photius said, well, as long as they hold the same dogmas as we do and the same canons as we do, we're willing to overlook that. But any other matters, different liturgical customs that are legitimate, what did he say? I just quoted is, if you observe them, if they're not against the Catholic and general decrees, there's no problem. All right. So, although of course, just so people know, we do give our priests give confirmation, chrismation immediately after baptism. So it doesn't seem like there's a lot to stand on in terms of, let's say, they weren't decrees of the whole Orthodox Church condemning, let's say the Mass is celebrated by St. Gregory the Great. I mean, it would be kind of ridiculous if you did do that, to somehow say that, the variable prefaces he used were evil or something.
Yeah.
If someone did that, it would essentially destroy, the concept of the church. And that's literally how dangerous such an idea would be, because it would essentially be saying that, all these Western saints like St. Gregory the Great, Pope St. Martin, etc., were just basically heretics, and that the ritual they celebrated was evil.
Yeah. Now that leads to, I guess, the second point that he brings up. And it says, in line with the argument above, some would say we shouldn't make icons of priests and Western saints because there's no living tradition on how they looked. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by living tradition, because if you look in painters' manuals of the 13th, 14th centuries and later on iconography, at times the descriptions given for all the saints, mostly Eastern saints, were extremely generic. They'll be like short old man with beard. Bald, and so the point is, there was a generic form in iconography that's always generally been used. I'm sure, Vlanika, you can speak more about actual iconography.
The painter's manual is actually from the late 1500s and early 1600s. That's the one
Yeah,
you're
but
thinking of.
well,
By Dionysius Fornus.
Forna, Forna. I thought it was 14th century, but in
No,
any case,
I think it's
it's.
later.
But the point I'm trying to make is that in terms of the concept of iconography, there's no such thing as a specific living tradition. Your living tradition is the icons you can find.
Yeah, well, let me bring a point. If you ever see an icon of any of the early saints before the let's say 12th century, who are Eastern bishops, and they're wearing the sacos, that's not what they wore. St. John Chrysostom, the sacos was something initially worn only by patriarchs of Constantinople, and then gradually in the 14th and 15th century they granted that to all other bishops.
Yeah.
Or I guess they granted to metropolitans, and it kind of got percolated down to all of them. All right.
I think probably one of the worst.
Now that doesn't mean if I see an icon of, let's say, St. John Chrysostom wearing a sacos and such, I'm going to get upset. Obviously, I'm not. For example, if you see an icon of any of the ancient saints, except unless of Constantinople or Greece, with epimachia on it, epimachia were not introduced into Byzantium until basically the 12th century. It was introduced from Syria because the patriarchs of Antioch were exiled by the Crusaders to Constantinople, and they brought many of their customs there. So, I mean, if you want to have someone who's going to make an historically accurate icon, then you'd have to argue throughout all these icons that show St. John Chrysostom, or some other saints wearing epimachia, or Sacosis or something like, or Midas.
Well, the whole point is
But that would be kind of ridiculous just to say let's destroy these icons because of that.
Well, I think there's a spiritual reality that's being portrayed as opposed to, as well as a physical reality.
Absolutely.
So Saint John appearing to someone else in a later date could very well be wearing a sacos.
Yes,
but
I agree.
But now one icon I do have a problem with, and it makes it questionable for me, is one that I've seen making the rounds on the internet of Saint Gregory the Great. Most icons I've seen of Saint Gregory the Great don't even have him wearing a hat, which is probably at least mostly correct.
Is the crown? Got the crown, the 3-tier.
The triple tiara, which is a very late innovation.
I think that's the 14th century or something.
Yeah,
like that.
Exactly. And why would you put? He's not wearing that in any century because that literally was used as a marker of the Pope's triple administration, something that existed that was created by Hildebrand. So it's not
even Hildebrand didn't have a triple tiara.
Yeah, so it's
very late.
And I don't understand why somebody would put that Roman Catholic monstrosity on top of the head of St. Gregory the Great.
One is that people simply have no idea of the old Western saints. They have a vague concept at best. They don't ask people who know anything about it. They don't try to learn themselves, and so they just type maybe into Google Images Gregory the Great, and they find an icon that looks, I guess maybe there's some idea people think that St. Gregory the Great was celebrating Mass like, I don't know, Leo the 13th, with being carried in the Sedi Gestatoria and with a triple crown and Baroque settings and whatever or something.
But that's an example of precisely what we're talking about in terms of innovations in doctrine that would have to be removed. The point is that's a case where in what's becoming an increasingly popular icon, you've introduced what was in fact a liturgical vestment that was based on heretical innovation.
Now, I should make a point that we do have iconography from before the schism.
Yeah, if you could clarify on that a little bit, because a lot of people think that it didn't exist.
Well, look at, for example, let's say one of the most well-preserved churches in Rome is Santa Maria Antiqua. I don't know if you look up that in Google Images, Santa Maria Antiqua. It was the church of the Roman Synod. It existed in the Forum. It was uncovered, the past few hundred years. Also, go to Ravenna. You don't have to look for something that was uncovered archaeologically in 1800. Go to Ravenna. Look at San Vitale. Look at there are numerous ancient churches in Rome itself. And you know what the iconography looks like? It basically looks like the Eastern iconography, because there was a common tradition that existed so much you can't really call it Byzantine iconography, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It was really Orthodox. You want to say Orthodox Roman iconography, that might be better, but it was just a general iconographic tradition existing. Yes, there you go. There you go. San Vitale, right there. You can find other ones. You can find, for example, the baptistry of the Orthodox in Ravenna. Now that got later messed up by Keble in the 1880s when he tried to quote unquote restore it, and they ended up adding one of these like Roman Catholic baptismal dishes to the hand of Saint John the Baptist. Yeah, there you go. If you go in right in, it looks like Saint John the Baptist is pouring water on the head. There are two baptistries in Ravenna. There's one called the Baptistry of the Arians, which was later taken over by the Orthodox, and then there's another called the Baptistry of the Orthodox, which was always Orthodox. And when the Baptistry of the Orthodox was restored, it looked exactly the same, except the hand on the mosaic of St. John the Baptist had been broken off. And so back in the 1880s, the restorer restored St. John's hand, but put like a little dish into it. So if you know the Roman Catholicism, where the priest would have this like little seashell, a concha,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and they pour the water in the baby's head. Well, he put that in his hand. And that's not what happened. If you look at all the other iconography, St. John is putting his hand on top of Christ's head as he does the baptism. You can look in the Winchester Benedictional St. Ethelwald, and the same iconography there. You can go to Roman iconography in ancient Roman churches. For example, San Clemente, which is built in the 500s, we think. I don't really know this. I'm actually quite surprised to hear the argument that we can't make iconography of the Western saints before the schism because we don't know what their iconography looked like. It's a rather weak argument. In fact, Saint Bede in his book on the lives of the abbots of Wearmouth Gero, the lives of the abbots, which you can find for free on Google Books, it's an English translation. It exists in an English translation. He talks about how that Saint Benedict Biscop, he was one of the abbots of Wearmouth Gero. He wasn't a bishop, but they called him Saint Benedict Biscop. That when he came back from Italy, he brought with him numerous icons and numerous iconographers, painters, and artisans from Gaul as well. And it talks about the making of the chancel screen that separated the sanctuary from the nave, and the putting of icons or on boards on it. We can look in the Liber Pontificalis, for example. You can look at the descriptions there that go hand in hand with all the ancient iconography preserved in Italy. And you can look at, let's say, what the 8th century entries for Pope St. Gregory II, St. Gregory III, who were, by the way, the first ones to anathematize the iconoclast heresy and such, and by the way. So, I mean, to me, that's not a real objection to talk about. We don't know what their iconography looked like or what they looked like, because, again, a lot of the iconography of the saints, as you notice, Father Joseph, has this kind of general trend to it.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
we can go on more, but
I think it's not. I think it's a pretty weak argument.
I mean, we have manuscript illuminations, which is a form of iconography. I grant.
Yeah.
In which Saint Bede is portrayed, and other figures are portrayed. Saint Augustine's portrayed in it. If you look at the iconography of Saint Augustine, that you see, let's say in Sicily, kind of done by Byzantine painters and others, they just paint Saint Augustine as what? They kind of paint him as kind of almost like he's a standard, Eastern bishop.
Yeah.
All right. Whereas we can look at the earliest images of Saint Augustine that exist on some churches' walls in Milan from the 600s or so, and he doesn't look like that. Now, I'm not going to argue to destroy those images, all right, or any icons of Saint Augustine that make him look like an Eastern bishop. But if they want to argue historically, yeah, we know pretty much what the early iconographers in Italy, how they drew Saint Augustine. So,
now the next question.
And Saint Ambrose, by the way, we have iconography of Saint Ambrose from the early period as well.
Yeah, so I mean,
if you're into early medieval and late antiquity art history, this is actually a well-studied field, by the way. And you
can find a lot on it.
Yeah, exactly. It's massive.
Okay. This is. This is an odd, kind of out of left field question here. But I shudder to put it up. But in any case, it says on the topic of Saint Gregory the Great, was his view that Saint Mary Magdalene was a whore accepted in the church as a whole? Many, especially the OCA, say the East regards Saint Mary Magdalene as not.
Let me answer this real quick.
Yeah.
There's a reason. There's a very good. Well, first off, I mean, I hate to reference Didymus to Blind, but there is actually some texts attributed to Didymus Blind in the 4th century that say that the woman caught in sins was, Saint Mary Magdalene. But I should, before you say that, before I go any further, if you look in the homilies of St. John Chrysostom, all right, and the homilies of most of the other fathers, Eastern fathers, you will, from the early period, you will not find any reference at all to the account in the Gospel of St. John of the woman caught in sin and who was going to be stoned. Now, why is that? Because in most of the Eastern lectionaries for a very long time, they did not have that in the Gospel of John. It exists in some ancient manuscripts, and it existed largely in most Latin manuscripts. And what happened is the 9th and 10th and 11th century, what happened is they began to gradually include the account. It's not fictional, it's true, the account of the woman called in adultery into the Greek lexicon, not lexicons, but the Greek manuscripts. For example, I don't even think, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody out there, but I don't even think in the Byzantine lectionary the account of the woman called in adultery is even there, simply because it was not in their manuscripts at the time they composed it. So if that's the case, and that is the case, now my question is that how could they have commented on it if they didn't have it in their gospels? When only it was contained in some Greek manuscripts, and the Byzantine Church later added it. All right, but it's mostly contained in Greek manuscripts that were copied and translated into Latin. So they had Now that being said, there are some Western writers, Orthodox writers, who don't believe the woman caught in adultery was Saint Mary Magdalene. Okay, there's, for example, sequences, which is the chant used outside of Lent and after the Alleluia and before the Gospel, in which, in some of them, the common sequence for virgin saint is given for her. Okay, so some agreed with Saint Gregory, some didn't agree with Saint Gregory, but Saint Gregory's he was arguing from, I guess, a previous existing tradition about the matter. So,
and we should also note that a woman caught in adultery is not necessarily a whore.
Now, it does say in the Gospel of St. John, but explicitly in all the copies, that St. Mary Magdalene, out of her Christ cast 7 devils, or 7 demons. And the commentary that St. Gregory gives is that these represented the 7, mortal sins, 7 deadly sins. All right? So, it was obviously for the demon. She is a holy saint, and she's, in fact, I can tell you in the sequence hymns and other texts in the Priests in West given about Saint Mary Magdalene, they call her that other blessed mother. All right, she was considered so important and so highly venerated that she was almost by many considered right under the Theotokos in terms of women saints. All right. She was called, that lesser one, but that other star of the sea. Whereas Stella Maris was reserved generally for the Mother of God. So I can't really see any of this as being an affront. It's simply an interpretation by St. Gregory, where St. Gregory says, look, maybe she was the woman caught in adultery due to what? The fact that out of her Christ, according to the Gospel of John, cast 7 devils or 7 demons. I think you can find some Eastern writers that later, when they began to comment on this, for example, like maybe St. Dimitri of Rostov and a few others, that will say it could be that she's the woman called in adultery and such. But they never, as far as I understand, declared it in a heretical interpretation or something like that. So, that's really not an anti-West. That's more of that's.
Okay. Something happened to Bishop Enoch's feed. There you go. Okay, you're back, somewhat. But the moral of the story is that it's not a complete reading of how the West or East saw Saint Mary Magdalene.
Can you hear me all right, Father?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Okay, and next we have Truth Be Told 2001. How many going to sleep prayers are there? Enough that if you say all of them, you won't go to sleep. There's so many different prayers before sleep that you could fill a book with just prayers before sleep, as well as morning prayers, especially if you have the liturgical offices. So, the question is...
Well, remember the Eastern prayers, the prayers before going to sleep you find in, let's say, Eastern prayer books are often a modified form of compliment.
Yeah.
For example, in the
Jordan Rulebook, yeah.
yeah,
That's
for
the most.
example, you can find in the Regularis Concordia of 972, where it gives that before one goes to sleep, one should say what are called the Trina Oratio, in this case, 6 psalms with 3 prayers, really 3 sets of prayers before going to sleep, and that's after Compline. That was supposed to be given. If you look in, let's say, the book of the 9th century book of the nuns of Saint Mary Winchester, I think they give. I think you can find 8 or 9 prayers that are before going to sleep. If you look in the prayer book of the Winchester prayer book from about the year 1000, you could probably find 20 or 30. How oftentimes you can find differences even within the East between, let's say, different prayer books on how many prayers they give before communion, say after communion, how they structure the evening.
Right. It varied so much that, I mean, the next question, what is the most popular one? Like the first question, these are going to be almost impossible to answer. They depended on the locality. They depended on what was being.
Well, we publish our own prayer book, so
yeah, exactly. So as far as I'm the most popular one among us is ours. So I don't know what else to say on that. But in any case, yeah, it's that's really all I can.
But maybe we should go on more about the positive case, because we're going back into the defensive case.
Yeah,
I suppose. So I'll let you say more about that, Father Joseph.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say was, if you take it as a whole, as a Westerner, there is I believe it was I want to say it was Calamiros who said a great gulf must be breached, or a Westerner's heart must be bent down low to understand something of orthodoxy. I think it's just enough to be bent down low to be saved. And what I mean by that is, if somebody has to completely transform their mind, not just their heart, but they have to reorient their thoughts in a way that is foreign to them, that can sometimes be productive, but a lot of the times it's unnecessary.
Well, remember also, if you're dealing, let's say, Ruthenian Uniates,
yeah,
or people from the Byzantine Uniate Papist groups, you can find some of their services that are almost identical. Or identical, except for who they commemorate in the litany, the Pope, the so-called Pope, to Orthodox Easterners. All right. Now, I can tell you the concept that you can just take these people whole in and everything be all right can prove disastrous. I mean, they did do that in around 1839 in Polotsk, the Polotsk Sobor, where they took in about 3 million Uniates in Belarus without baptism, chrismation. They just used confession. They didn't quite use confession of faith in the way we think. They did it for the bishops, and just people followed along. But they did bring in, kind of some of these weird customs and such. I don't want to get too much into it. And anyway, do you see my point in bringing that up, Father Joseph?
Yeah,
they say the people became part of the church, and they gradually had to work on things and all this other stuff. All right, but it didn't. It also created problems too. Anyway.
Okay. Yeah, Rambles commented saying Arsenius of Paris did say the church in the British Isles will only begin to grow when she begins to venerate again her saints. A lot of people have interpreted that to mean something to the effect of inserting British saints in the calendar, and to the credit of many synods, they have in fact done that. But it's a very I don't want to denigrate it by saying it's kind of a superficial form of veneration, but it's not the same as bringing back the veneration that they had beforehand, because it will never be the same.
Well, Mayor, I think you can say part of the case is we have to say, do you respect what St. Gregory the Great, St. Martin, St. Dunstan, St. Ethelwald, do you respect what essentially they did liturgically as being holy? All right? And either they say they don't, in which case they don't really venerate a saint, okay? Or they say they do.
And in many cases, these Westerners are familiar with forms that they could say they do, and they're perfectly familiar to us. And so there's no reason to make them undergo an unnecessary yoke. But that's
Now that also means, however, I have to jump ahead, that when people become Western Rite Orthodox, whether they convert directly from let's say non-Orthodoxy to Orthodoxy, or they come from an Eastern background because they were Western convert, obviously, they have to give up bringing things that are not part of the Western Rite pre-schism Orthodox heritage, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
So,
well, that lends to another question that Rambles had earlier, which I guess is where we can jump into this, and it's thoughts on Roquefort and Antioch's Western rites. Antioch is known for using RC devotions, and I believe even unleavened bread. I could be wrong, admittedly, which is pretty pathetic. I'll be honest. I think that those things can go away on their own, and they should. But it's not. Wouldn't say it's universal with Roquefort, because I know that Roquefort seems to be swinging back into following Father Aidan's lead, who came from us. So I think that may actually be healthy for them. Antioch. I know the Anglicans are not that. The Anglican ones are not that big on stuff like the Stations of the Cross and the.
But then they have the Anglican stuff. So.
Yeah, exactly. So you have two different sets of problems there. And the bread, I just don't even get it. They throw yeast into a slurry, but then they flash fry it so that it doesn't do anything.
Yeah, and so it should be simple that if somebody is an Orthodox bishop, and there is somebody who does something like uses an unleavened host or bread, or a so-called leavened host, which they're not really leavened, okay? What's the proper reaction? Proper reaction, say stop.
Yeah, and just
and
use
if you don't,
bread.
And if you don't stop, action will be taken.
Yeah,
right.
But
that doesn't mean we're trying to go out our way to depose people, but you have to obey the ecclesiastical universal custom on this point. This is not an Easternization. Almost every scholar who studied the issue admits that unleavened bread was not used until essentially you get to the 11th century.
Yeah.
Right.
And so,
in fact, even the attempts to interpret Alcuin of York as supporting unleavened bread fell flat on their face when you realize that what he was arguing against was putting salt in bread, because that is something he had learned from monks from Jerusalem. And since apparently there was a custom in Jerusalem against putting salt into the prosper that was going to be made, that exists apparently. All right, but he was not arguing for unleavened bread. Right. Now, I put salt in the bread I make for the Eucharist, obviously, but there's a lot of, for example, there was that one saint in the monastery, St. Gall, and I can't remember the name of the saint it's talked about, in which people tried to say that at the monastery, St. Gall, in the late 9th century, they were using unleavened bread. When you look at the actual life of the saint they're quoting, it's saying that they brought this hermit bread, and the bread was unleavened because he said, don't worry about, just put some, in for him to eat. All right. They just brought him unleavened bread because he didn't care how fast they cooked it. They brought him, honey, things like that. This was stuff he was just consuming, if you know what I mean. This is not stuff he was using for the Eucharist. All right.
Yeah.
He wasn't consuming even wafers. I mean, it was just kind of one of these Middle Eastern unleavened flatbreads or something like that, I guess, which technically a lot of flatbread actually isn't, as we learn later, isn't really unleavened bread, by the way. But anyway.
Now, the next question, I guess, Son of Seth wrote, what is the house that Paul speaks here? So that as he is God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, in this particular case, that is, let me just switch over so we can take a look at the verse that's being referred to here. And that's
2 Thessalonians?
Yep. And so, hold on. Give me a moment. I will put it up right now.
So this is a question between whether the house is the rebuilt Jewish temple that the Antichrist will set in, or is it, let's say, the Antichrist will try to set in, I don't know, the Holy Sepulchre Church?
Yeah.
And such. I've heard different interpretations on that. I've heard some say that it can't, that since it's called the house of the temple of God, a rebuilt Jewish temple, one argument is wouldn't really do the temple of God. All right. But
from what I understand, the traditional patristic interpretation of the apocalypse on that allows for both, because the temple has to be rebuilt for Antichrist to celebrate him, but he's enthroned in the church at Jerusalem.
Well, we can look in St. Chrysostom's commentary, can't we?
Yeah, hold on. I can go get that. Hold on.
And it's 2 Thessalonians, what is it? 2 Thessalonians
2:4, yeah. Give me a moment.
Homily of the second epistle. It is in homily 2.
Okay, give me a moment. I'm still doing my clicking here, because we do this live, so when we don't get okay, so that's Thessalonians. All right, so we got to go to the table of contents. Hold on. Moving along.
We're just going to transition into doing general questions at this point. I'm just
I guess we can, yeah. I mean, because we've been talking about it for about 40 minutes or so, and I think that's enough of a time to do that. So let's take a look here. Homilies of, okay, for Second Thessalonians. And you said it was homily 2.
can you bring up the scriptural verse again, Father Joseph, so I can see it?
Well, I closed it, but hold on. Because now, give me a moment. Oh boy. Hold on. Okay, so I actually overwrote.
Okay, so verse 3 and 4 says, "Let no man beguile you in any wise, for it will not be except the falling away come first, and the man of sin be revealed." Here I can put the verse, the chat. I can put the St. John Chrysostom. It says, "The son of perdition, he that opposeth and exalteth himself against all that is called God, or that is worship, so that he sitteth in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God." Now, here is St. John Chrysostom's commentary. St. Chrysostom says, here he discourses concerning the Antichrist and reveals great mysteries. What is the falling away? He calls him apostasy, as being about to destroy many and make them fall away. So that if it were possible, he says, the very elect should be offended. And he calls him the man of sin, for he shall do numberless mischiefs and shall cause others to do them. But he calls him the son of perdition, because he is also to be destroyed. But who is he? Is it then Satan? By no means, but some man that admits his fully working in him, for he is a man, and exalteth himself against all that is called God or worship. For he will not introduce idolatry, but will be a kind of opponent to God. He will abolish all the gods and will order men to worship him instead of God, and he will be seated in the temple of God, not that in Jerusalem only, but also in every church. Setting himself forth, he says, he does not say saying it, but endeavoring to show it. For he will perform great works and will show many wonderful signs. So St. Chrysostom's commentary seems to be, it's not just some physical temple in Jerusalem. He's going to enshrine himself in every church. That means public church building, I would assume, at that point.
Yep.
So there will not be any public, if someone attempts to do public services and worshiping in the true Orthodox godly fashion, they won't be able to do that publicly without being killed by the Antichrist.
Okay, now Ramels made the comment on a positive note. If you read the lives of Western saints like Cuthbert, Benedict, Martin of Tours, etc., you don't see any sort of unorthodox spirituality like those after the schism. That's absolutely true.
In fact, there's a massive, if you start that's a very interesting point. As soon as the Hildebrandian schism and heresy happened, and then you start to see people writing the lives of the saints in that period, you see this gradual transformation, Father Joseph.
Yep. No, I know.
Between how the behaviors first, it starts with a little stuff, then it gets more and more. There's some big stuff into visions about Christ telling them how great they are. And you get to the point of Francis of Assisi talking about how he's one of the predestined elect and one thing after the other. The stigmata, there's no conclusive evidence anybody claimed to have or could claim to have stigmata before Francis of Assisi, by the way. So, again, I don't know what to say. I mean, you look at, let's say, the life of Saint Swithin, for example, which was recently translated about a few years ago. And Saint Swithin was from 850s in England. And you read his life, and let's say you read the life of, I don't know, Ignatius Loyola or something like that. All right, now you start to notice massive differences in their practices.
Yeah.
Saint Swithin wasn't interested in demanding God-given visions. He wasn't interested in doing exercises where he's helping St. Joseph gather firewood or something like that. St. Swithin's spirituality, if you want to, what was it? It was singing the public divine office, celebrating the liturgy of the Mass, doing the sacraments, praying, saying the Psalter constantly, prostrating, fasting. It was identical in a large sense, in the essential sense, to the saints hundreds of years before. All right. So, I mean, I know people don't like that.
Yeah, it's not nearly the Western Rite is not nearly as exciting as people think. It's not like if you've grown used to the concept of liturgy being foreign, this is the most unforeign thing we can get. Sean wrote "fell flat," LOL. I'm not sure what that is a reference to. Okay, a friend wrote, "What is the view of old calendarists within the Western Rite?" I think what I hope you mean what is the view of the Western Rite among old calendarists, because the Western Rite is a rite. It's not actually a person. So the point is, I assume you mean how old calendarists feel about the Western Rite. There's various views. I would say, from what I have seen, the view of most old calendarists, like the view of most new calendarists towards their own Western Rite people, is generally somewhat cautious, or it ranges from cautiously positive to incredibly negative. So I'm going to be honest. This
The
is
most of us can hope for is simply respect when we do what we should do,
yeah, and that's but
and
that's all.
non-interference unless they can claim we're actually doing something heretical. I mean,
Yeah,
if someone claiming I'm doing something heretical, I'll stop it immediately. I'm pretty sure I'm not. I pray, I don't think I am, but that's true of anybody, whoever they are.
yeah, and
Right?
so I mean that we should be as humble, no matter what ritual we are, towards the truth, than anything else. This is gonna touch on something I'm gonna have a lot to say on this, Felica, but oh, okay, wait, this one, and because it says I heard that Reason and Theology is trying to set up an old calendarist versus new calendarist debate. Would you, Bishop Enoch and Deacon Joseph, be interested in going on? Vladika, if you don't mind, I'd like to answer this question
Go
first.
ahead. Go ahead.
And my answer is absolutely not. And I'm going to say why. After I was on, and we had the Fatima discussion with William Albrecht. This was after Craig Trullia, who was on Reason and Theology but was kicked off. What's it called? Was on our show and talked to us. And he was very respectful and polite, and I would not mind having him back on the show again. And I've tried to be supportive of what he's doing. Reason and Theology is basically a Roman Catholic show that poses as a philosophy and discussion show. And the whole purpose of setting up an old calendarist versus new calendarist debate on their show is to say, look at their division. You should join Rome. They won't say it directly, but they'll say it in a kind of offhand sense, like, it's too bad there's not a mediator for these folks, and things like
do
that.
they set up a Sedevacantist versus pro-Vatican debate then?
Well, I would say no. They generally don't. They kind of like they do. The problem is that they do understand that the concepts behind like Sedevacantism, etc., are still Roman Catholic. So they kind of can look at it. They're not positive towards Sedevacantism.
Well, the concept of division within some generally identified religious world exists within people who would call themselves Roman Catholic as well. SSPX,
yes.
SSPV, Sedepravationists, Conclave, Sedevacantists.
Sure. But I think the real reason that this is a bother to them is because
and in papacy and in the papal centralism didn't solve that issue.
No, it didn't. And more importantly, what I would say is this on the matter, is that when you're using the patristic method for apologetics, which is to go back to the fathers in terms of how we are to interpret the scripture, how we are to interpret the teaching of the church, some new calendarists do that. And what they want is for those folks to get into fights with us. But if we're talking about Orthodox apologetics, as far as I'm concerned, if you're using the Holy Fathers to defend the faith, you're going to do it right. You may come to conclusions that I may not agree with, and we can fight those out, but I'm not going to do it on a Roman Catholic show to show off the divisions between us. I absolutely will not.
Well, my answer would simply be no, because I've actually offered to do this several times for several years, and no one's taken it up, and I'm actually suspicious now when people want to do it now, because is there some other ulterior motive? And
in this case,
secondly, the other point is oftentimes other quote unquote old calendarists will like to try to tag me in conversations, and so I can debate some a new calendarist or an ecumenist or something like that. And then after they have all my answers, then they're behind my back, begin attacking me in my jurisdiction. They only want me because they think, oh, I'm a good debater or something like that. So what I say is go to these other old calendar jurisdictions and find somebody there.
Well, I think what they tried to do, and this is specifically the case of Reason and Theology, and I'm happy to see the positive that came out of it with Craig working with Father John Whiteford on his show, is they tried to have an episode where they were talking about the calendar discussion, and they expected Father John to completely rip us up, because he's been a large critic of us for ages. So I think they thought that was an easy target, and he basically started talking about the problem of ecumenism, which set up the end of Craig's time on the show after the whole Albrecht debacle. And so no, I absolutely if I will not do it for Reason and Theology. I won't, and I don't think any Orthodox should. And so that's my answer.
Again, like I say, go to other groups and start asking them.
Yeah, sure. You can. There's loads of old calendarists. I'm sure one of them would love to be on the show, but I'm just stating the real reason that it's being done. Okay. Callistos Ware claims St. Macarius of Egypt had stigma. While he's wrong. He claimed that there's a life that says a cherubim gave him stigma or something. I don't know much about this desert father, admittedly.
I'd have to see the quotation about this.
Yeah.
Because I've seen so much stuff where they're reading back into some desert father, something that didn't exist there, or some earlier saint. So I'd have to see what verse they talk, what part of the life of Saint Macarius. Are they claiming that Saint Macarius in a homily said something like he bears the marks of the Lord Jesus? Well, that goes back to what Saint Paul said. So the question is, what do the fathers say? Saint Paul, as far as I know, they're nowhere talking about Saint Paul having holes, the nail holes in his hands and in his or it's really it would be his wrists.
Although you will
his hands. His hand.
Roman Catholics will often say that the first stigmatist was Saint Paul. And they'll often use that very biblical verse, even though that's not what the fathers taught.
That's just begging the question about what the fathers taught about that.
Yeah. Rambo said Rome is the most divided. I mean, the SSPX and said this. LOL. Well, that's in my opinion, the top argument for why you should have a Western Rite. It would be familiar to them. While if they finally accepted Orthodox theology, it wouldn't be that much more difficult to learn the chants, etc. But they would have to actually become Orthodox. And so that's
my encounter with a number of Sedevacantists and SSPX. I mean, I think you remember a few years ago when I think I either was a deacon, maybe still, or maybe I was just become a priest. And I don't know if I think you maybe help with it.
We wrote an open letter to them.
Traditionalist Roman Catholics or something like that.
Yeah, you can still find it online somewhere.
Yeah, and we were like, well, let's just find a lot of email addresses for these traditionalist RC groups and just start sending it and see what happens. I was like, well, maybe it would be bad. And I think I got 2 or 3 replies back. And one of them eventually was trying to debate me. And then after the 3rd email, they say, please stop talking to me or I'll leave religion altogether. And I was like, what? Whoa.
Yeah, it's like,
I was like, whoa.
It's like, how far on the precipice are you? If that's
wow. And I was like, wow, something's because what it was with a lot of the Sedevacantists, they're so entangled about they have no papacy. It's like people who go to the Diamond Brothers. Eventually, the Diamond Brothers move to the point where they don't even go to any church services because they don't believe, they can't go to the unions anymore. They just tell people stay home and say the rosary or something like that.
Yeah,
they're so on the verge. So many of them of simply just completely leaving either religion altogether or becoming effectively a priestless Sedevacantist. All right.
Well, and the worst part about that is that it never occurs to them that maybe the Catholic Church isn't where they thought it was. It just they have to assume the Catholic Church failed
because they're so committed to people. Let's say like I don't know, some 19th century German nun who had a vision or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I've seen to them that is the ancient church, and I've noticed this is a problematic issue with many RCs, where talking about Saint Martin of Tours, Saint Gregory the Great. St. John Cassian, St. Ethelwald, it's a vague area at best with them, and they're not really interested in reading them. When they're more interested in, now they can argue, well, we're interested because we have a living tradition of saints in the 19th and 20th century. Well, Orthodoxy does, of course, too. But Orthodox, even look at St. Ignatius Bryanchaninov, you look at the 19th century Russian saints, they were referring to St. Chrysostom and St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, all the earlier fathers as well, because they recognize something important about those early fathers in their battles with the heretics and other evils. All right, that they were always referring to them and thinking of the earlier fathers as this important marking point. Now, that does not mean the tradition of the fathers teach like St. Ignatius Bryanchaninov, St. Theophile the Recluse. It ends, they're not saints. They are saints and they are fathers. But even they would say, look, the teachings of the ecumenical councils and the fathers taught by them, with their interpretation of the scripture, there's a supreme understanding there. If you know what I mean, Father Joseph.
Yeah. No.
So again, that's my encounter was that one who said, "Don't ever contact me again." I was trying to be nice. I was thinking I didn't know what was going on. I think what happened is I eventually pointed out that one of their arguments was essentially Sabellianism, because they were quoting Thomas Aquinas so much, and they were like, the persons aren't real, and they were saying things, the persons only exist in some sort of phantom way. I was like, wow. I said, I think technically that's not even Roman Catholicism. I mean, it might be eventually what it leads to and such. And I quoted St. John Damascene, and they got upset and they don't ever contact me again. And then there were one or two other respondents, and they kind of just, didn't only respond after the second or third email. And that was it. Now, one person did come out of that who did get baptized. So
there was a positive.
Yeah. So I mean, that did have one person did come to the church and was baptized by one of our priests. So that did happen. Because, it was a former SSPX person. So I mean, I guess it was all worth it just to have one person join the church. But
and
again, but I think that's a major problem when dealing with SSPX and sedevacantists is if they deal with the early fathers, the first millennial fathers, especially the fathers of the first 600 years or something like that. It seems that they're generally dealing with them through a mediated course, like or Jurgens or something like that, or a quotation mine, a quotation factory, if you know what I mean, where it's like essentially you might say the quotation they give of Saint Chrysostom, or really let's say Saint Leo the Great or something, maybe like 4 lines or something like that, and instead of saying look at the whole letter, all right. So I think Father Joseph is muted.
Oh, I'm here.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, I don't know much more to say on that, but
yeah, I mean, ultimately, I find that even though it sounds nice if traditionalist Roman Catholics came to the Western Orthodox, they should really consider it. But I've found that many of them are very desperate and kind of on the end of their rope when it comes to Roman Catholicism and even religion altogether. They need to find the true Catholic Church, and that's the Orthodox Church. And if they don't even bother to question whether their original presuppositions might have been wrong concerning the Pope, it's a lot harder to reach out to them.
I mean, you can say in a certain sense, Orthodox have been sedevacantists since basically the mid-11th century. Well, to some extent, we were claiming that there has been no legitimate pope since maybe unless you want to claim that Weber de Ravenna was a legitimate pope, which
I technically tend towards that view, but
let's say you're 1100 then, with the Weber de Ravenna. I'm not endorsing him, but I'm just saying that they're just trying to isolate and say everything went wrong in 1969, okay, or in 1964. And then some of them, like SSPV people, some of the CMRI people, will eventually say, well, Pius XII, who was Pope before John the 23rd.
Yeah,
they'll actually admit and say stuff like, well, he wasn't. They're like, well, he was a good Pope, but he made a whole bunch of terrible mistakes. And they're talking about how Pius XII, for example, would say stuff like, whatever Jungmann says liturgically, I agree with. And Jungmann was essentially one of the people who, before Bugnini, had kind of helped devise the proto Novus Ordo. All right, and the whole so-called Holy Week reform, in which they basically messed up. Well, they'd almost kept actually some of the old Roman Rite Holy Week services, and they messed them up in the 50s.
Yeah, and
they abolished certain things and such. So I mean, and it goes back. I mean, are you going to go back to Vatican I? What you have to do is go back to Hildebrand, Leo, and by Hildebrand, I don't just mean him, Gregory the Seventh, so-called Gregory the Seventh, elected in 1070. I think it was 1070. What I'm talking about, Hildebrand was there with Leo the Ninth. Hildebrand was him and what's his name, Cardinal the Humbert. They ran Leo the Ninth.
Yeah, and so one thing to keep in mind is we did the first series we did on this channel. Was Who Invented the Roman Catholic Church. And what I would recommend to any of your sedevacantist friends, so on and so forth, is have them watch that first, because they have to understand the gravity of the change in their thinking that has to take place. And in many cases, it leads to shock.
If it makes them angry, that's also good.
Well, it's good because of the fact that at least it's opened their mind to the possibility that maybe they were wrong about where they thought the Catholic Church was, and not get to the desperate point that so many of these people do. And we really need to pray for those people and hope for the best for them. But once they're at that far down that they think the Diamond Brothers are legitimate in their trailer park, frankly, they're already.
Don't mention the trailer. That's not.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
I've had family that lives in trailer parks. I mean.
Yeah, okay.
Let me tell you, Father Joseph, I grew up so poor that I wish I had lived in a trailer park at some points. So, I mean,
that's fair. I was not trying to. I shouldn't have said that. What I should say is this: they're a priestless body that used to go to the Uniates until they couldn't anymore, and now they're just literally sitting there floating and telling people to pray the rosary and hope things turn out.
And what happens is simply this, and people think, oh, you have a long YouTube video. This guy on YouTube said this. His arguments seem convincing. Well, I'm going to say the same thing. Don't just listen to us because we're on YouTube or we're giving you an hour video. Go read the scriptures and the fathers and the canons of the church and the saints.
Yep.
Right? So, don't just say I listened to 40 Diamond Brothers videos, and they brought up these quotes, and I can't answer them, and therefore you're going to be like St. Paul says. What does he say? He says a man who is carried back with every wind of doctrine. All right, carried back and forth because they hear this argument, they hear that argument. They've got no stability, and as a result of that, some of them eventually give up altogether.
And that's what
the devil wants actually to happen.
Yeah,
right?
the true stability.
Someone who's completely apathetic and who loses faith in anything completely, I can deal with a sincere heretic because I understand there's a sincerity there. It's wrong and it's going to lead them to spiritual problems. But the sincerity is not what I'm against, Father Joseph.
A sincere heretic is right.
They're wrong about the matters of fact and other issues.
Yeah,
right?
That can be corrected.
Yes.
That I would say that you're better served, instead of watching 40 YouTube videos, just reading St. Gregory the Great. You would be a million times better served just reading through his letters. But in any case, we've got more comments. John Ridlin wrote Protestants. I'm not sure what that meant, but okay, maybe he'll expand on it. Ramble said it's interesting to know how close East and West were before the schism. St. John of the Latter praised St. John Cassian, who was ordained a deacon by St. John Chrysostom and lived with the Egyptian monks, for example. Okay.
Yes, that's true.
And then Griffiths 520 says, I started catechism recently and I attend a Western Rite Antiochian church. I love both the Western and Eastern Rite. And as long as you are respecting and loving their legitimate heritage, you should. Because if you're talking about the legitimate heritage of East and West, there should be no essential difference in your mind. In that sense, it's good to attend both. But one thing to keep in mind is you always have to go back to those fathers. Because what I have seen also is that people who don't get into the life of using the Western fathers, of reading the Western fathers, they end up, saying, why am I Western Rite to begin with? Because, it kind of feels like in many cases, it can feel like a stopover from Roman Catholicism or Protestantism. And that just means that you weren't paying as much attention as you could be. So never lose that desire for service. Never lose that desire for prayer. Saint Benedict as well was inspired by the rule of Saint Basil and lived with Egyptian monks. Yes, that is absolutely true.
Saint Benedict himself did not live with Egyptian monks, though. I mean, unless they went to
Oh yeah, okay.
He was taught by Saint Romanus the Elder, but I don't know if he was Egyptian. Saint Benedict never really left Italy, as I understand. But what is true is in Saint Benedict's role, he talks about the role of Saint
Basil. He talks about Saint Basil
in the conference of Saint John Cassian. He had no disrespect at all. In fact, Saint Benedict mainly seems concerned. A lot of his role, if you read it, is concerned with one, how to structure the divine offices, the Psalms and things like that. He doesn't even tell you what antiphons, because that kind of grew up by tradition, different areas. But the structure of the Psalms and the steps of humility, the ladder of humility, for example.
Yeah.
And he says in some points, if the abbot or the monks, abbots of certain monasteries feel that some part of my role might need to be modified for local circumstances, there's no problem doing that, because Saint Benedict, remember, one of the issues he had in Italy was that a lot of the Irish monks had flooded the continent, and that was a good thing. They were converting people, pagans and such. But the Irish rules were extreme. They were saying you need to say the whole Psalter twice a day.
Yeah.
You have to do a certain amount you need to do 300 prostrations a day. It was one thing after the other, and this is not meant to attack those devout monks who did that, but they were coming into France and Italy, and people were trying to do this at monasteries run by Irish abbots, and they were failing. And then the abbot was just saying, "Look, you're not." You just kept on saying you're not doing it right, and people had so much despair of the fact they could not do this extremely, very zealous, harsh rule, even there's that they quit, they gave up, and some of them became gyrovags, where they wanted to kind of try to still be monks, but kind of wander around. Others gave up completely, and so Saint Benedict's rule is that its purpose was to try to create a monastic environment in which you could still do the divine office, you can still have a monastic life. And it wasn't to be easy, but it wasn't to be, falsely harsh. It was to be kind of a well-regulated community, if you know what I mean.
It's also worth noting.
But that's not different than what St. Basil wanted, by the way.
Right, and it's important to note because there is so much, and it seems to have calmed down a bit, but it was very big when I first converted in the late '90s and early 2000s. This concept of Celtic spirituality that was
Yes.
kind of detached from reality because the Irish, the Celtic monks had such vigor and they had such an ascetic practice that I can literally tell you that over 100 books that were written about Celtic spirituality were written from a flaky and oftentimes effeminate and homosexual viewpoint that had nothing to do with actual legitimate Celtic spirituality. They quoted a poem or a breastplate once, and then the rest they wrote was out of their own imaginations.
Yeah, I mean, you meet Saint Mokta from the 500s, or Saint Angus the Coldee, who reposed around 820.
Yeah,
and them talking about 300 genuflections and prostrations. Make sure you read the whole Psalter, and you have to sing the Divine Office, and you go to Mass every day, and you have to do this amount of manual labor, and you have to do this, and the fact that a lot of these Irish monks, when they were going off into the continent and maintaining these ascetic practices and preaching to the pagans, were being martyred. I mean, up into the 900s, when they were going to preaching to the Danes. All right. They weren't preaching, nor were St. Benedict preaching. I mean, St. Benedict, for people forget, St. Benedict had to contest with rural pagans who were still worshiping Apollo, which oftentimes meant human sacrifice in some of these rural areas and weird stuff, all right? And St. Benedict had to fight them, not physically fight them. He actually did turn over the idol of Apollo one time, which was in this rural village.
By the way, we have a guy who's called Apollo in the chat, so totally not related to you, but it just came up.
Pagan deity. So I oftentimes was wondered that if any of these people talk about quote unquote Celtic spirituality in the flaky, effeminate way you're talking, if they met the Celtic monks would be horrified at what these people are saying about them.
Yeah, they would.
Right?
No,
and they would have a mouth. They would hear a great deal from the monk about all the evil things they're doing.
Okay, now, okay,
all the evil things the pagans are doing. So go ahead.
Okay, so Rambles of St. Gregory the Great created the pre-sanctified liturgy. So is that liturgy we use during Lent full of Western influence? LOL. Actually, probably not. St. Gregory he acted, was he an Apocrisiarius to Constantinople at the time for a while?
Well, let me be frank. The pre-sanctified liturgy existed way before St. Gregory the Great. It's in the canons of Laodicea. What is called the liturgy, the Troparion or the Politikion is used of St. Gregory for that liturgy, for the pre-sanctified liturgy. But there isn't a lot of strong evidence that he structured it. He created that existing structure, if you know what I mean.
It's a typical with a communion service.
Yes. It's actually a Vespers, with his liturgy and Vespers kind of combined and such. And now that does exist in some cases, but so that doesn't mean he didn't have an influence. I don't know what exactly his influence was on me. And he is honored with that name. That is true. But I don't believe it means necessarily any more than we can say that St. John Chrysostom sat down and wrote everything out in the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, if you know what I mean.
I think, from what I understand, he's credited with bringing the practice to Constantinople of doing the pre-sanctified liturgy in that region, but he didn't actually. I don't think he used the practices of the West to do that.
No, because in the West at the time, all the evidence I've ever seen from that is that they only serve the pre-sanctified liturgy actually on Holy Friday. Now, that is a canonical question that later becomes after Trullo says pre-sanctified liturgy is only on weekdays in Great Lent, except for Annunciation falling on it. Okay, and how did Trullo get accepted into the West? And that's kind of an interesting historical point altogether. Now, we do pre-sanctified masses on all weekdays in Great Lent, all right, because we accept the canons of Trullo, all right. But it seems evident from the historical sources that at the time of St. Gregory the Great, in Rome, they were not doing pre-sanctified Mass except on Holy Friday. Although in Milan, on Thursdays and in Fridays, they actually did do some sort of short service with communion. So that was essentially a pre-sanctified, I guess you can say.
Okay.
But it's still interesting discussion, I think.
All right. Paleo Paul asks, is the Rosary a post-schism practice? If so, why is my local Western Rite parish encouraging its use? With events like Fatima seemingly being opposed to Orthodoxy, this seems odd to promote its use.
He's right. You should not promote its use.
You shouldn't promote its use. As much as I hate to say this, and maybe I'm gonna get hate from somebody in the vicariate for saying this, but Rosary Hour is a very common Roman Catholic practice that usually keeps a lot of the old grandmothers together, and I don't want to imply that it's maybe to kind of keep some sort of external unity that existed before they joined the Antiochians that really promoted the whole Rosary Hour thing. I don't know why they do it. I do know that there's also some Russian ecumenists who like to argue that somebody used some form of the Rosary, which I don't buy into because I've never seen real evidence for it.
They're talking about that supposedly the new martyr, Saint Seraphim of Vernitsa,
right?
That he gave his nuns the role that they should say "Rejoice, O Virgin Theotokos" 300 times.
Yeah, well, but then it became you see a later disciple saying that it's structured basically like the Rosary.
Well, they gradually transmogrifies from simply saying "Rejoice, O Virgin" to becoming meditations and such.
We would recommend, I mean, at least I would recommend, I think Vladika would agree, using the little office of the Blessed Virgin of the Theotokos if you want to. We do publish a form of that. Encourage its use in that parish.
That's interesting, and that goes back to the Jesuit point, by the way, that this almost complete gradual degradation since the past 500 years, even in the post-schism West, of the divine office is just sidelining.
Yeah,
where it was interpreted as only being for stuff for monks and monasteries, when that was never the case, and they replaced it because the Jesuits argued and others that, well, this is too much to ask people to go to Vespers and to go to Matins in the morning, and let's just say just do the Rosary and go to this low Mass service, because they had this concept that they had this concept almost that if you make it easier, people would want to stay with Rome and not go to the Protestants, I guess, or something.
Yeah.
In fact, there was a point in the 1600s in which the Jesuits in the Vatican were trying to get the Irish to abandon the Advent fast, and the Irish would not do it. They were trying to say you can, eat meat on these Wednesdays and Sundays in Advent, and the Irish would not do it. And they gave indulgence after indulgence, into eventually, by the 1800s, they got most of the Irish to gradually stop doing it. And by the early 20th century, they had also, after 1913, 1914 in the Vatican, they kind of got rid of, the traditional Advent fasting rules, even for everybody else. But anyway.
I hope that answers the question. There are traditional Western Orthodox ways to venerate the Theotokos if you want to. But you
want to say it's not the Rosary, and they want the Rosary. See that, right. But that's the problem.
Yeah, and so it's an uphill battle. That's all we'll say. I would suggest.
It's not a problem with any of my people. But,
no, of course, and exactly. And so, but
if it is, I end it really quick.
Yeah. Now let's take a look here. Efren Alvarado says, what would be some key points for discussing the essence energies distinction with Catholics? Well, I would start, honestly, by pointing to Western fathers who use the term essence and operations, because one thing you have to establish, especially now, thanks to recent video claims and so on and so forth, that this is some sort of late pagan innovation, is that that's the traditional language of the church. It's simply used in a different manner, but it was to stop the advent of other heresies, and namely Barlaamism. And so really what you want to point to is you can point to different fathers like the Lateran Synod talking about the operations of God. And, it shouldn't be difficult to understand, because God does dwell in an approachable light, and yet he interacts with us in reality. So this shouldn't be as complicated as people try to make it.
Also, remember, something important about this is to ask them, do they believe in the doctrine of deification, as taught by the Latin Fathers? Because if they do, are those, when St. Ambrose and St. Augustine and St. Leo the Great and others are saying that when we become partakers of of divinity, the divine nature, like St. Peter says, are they saying we become God in and of itself? Well, no, of course they're not. That's pantheism. But then how are we becoming? We're not becoming God in and of itself, but we're partaking of God. If we're partaking of God, we're not partaking of the innermost being of God. What is that's what we call the essence of God. So if we're not partaking of the innermost being of God, then what are we partaking of? Well, the operations. So a lot of this can be swept away by looking at the doctrine of deification as taught by the early Latin fathers, I think, because that's all connected, Father Joseph, as you know, with essence energies.
Yeah, of course.
Right. So if somebody says, I don't believe in essence energies, but I still believe in deification, well then either you're a pantheist or there's no real deification taking place.
Exactly. And you can even relate that even to the reception of the Eucharist. I mean, it's just that it all ties together, unfortunately.
Because if they say, well, you only partake of the body and blood and soul, but the divinity has no impact on you, well, then that's almost an Nestorian doctrine then.
Exactly.
How does divinity, is God really interacting with physical matter or not? That's what it goes down to. So.
All right, and now Alex H. asks, what are your thoughts on the scholarly consensus, oh boy, that the writings of St. Dionysius Europacet are pseudographical and the use of the writings differently among East and West Erigena, Aquinas, etc.? Well, I mean, I'll throw in my 2 cents. I'm sure that Vladika will have more to say on this, but I don't care about the scholarly consensus. I think that the writings of St. Dionysius are the writings of St. Dionysius. I'm not going to, I mean, there have been articles written defending the view that it is St. Dionysius. And I'm not going to call him pseudo Dionysius because some guy, PhD says so. It's just not how things work for me. Vladika, what would you can probably?
I agree, and there was one episode where we discussed this for like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
In which, I mean, you can argue that there are schola, there is commentary on the text that may not originally have been St. Dionysius's, but that doesn't really mean the essence of the text is not St. Dionysius. So. Again, schola comment. I mean, there's an argument that Saint Dionysius of Alexandria had marginal notes from the works of Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, and that later, when they were copied, the marginal notes were copied into the whole text. If you know what I mean.
Yeah,
but again, that's not the same as. I mean, that's not actually the same as arguing
that Saint Dionysius was not the author of his text.
Yes.
Okay, and so let's see here. Most of the other stuff is, it's, thanks and other comments, but I don't see any other questions. If there are any other questions, we'll stick around for a minute or two, or, we can always, wait till next week where we go to the show that we were discussing. Oh, wait. Okay. Rambles did ask a question. How does the Benedictine order differ from later RC orders like the Franciscans and Jesuits?
The Franciscans and Jesuits don't claim to be monastic orders.
Yeah,
people who call the Franciscans monks, that's really not accurate. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, one thing we have to get out of our minds is the concept of Roman Catholic orders. And I think the big danger is that when we talk about people following the rule of St. Benedict, a lot of people like saying the order of St. Benedict. But the order of St. Benedict has a specific meaning in Roman Catholicism, which can allow for a mindset transfer that's not complete. And what I mean by that is that in Orthodoxy, there are different rules for monastic life. Those aren't orders proper. This is why the concept of the Basilian order only came around after Uniatism, because they had to figure out, well, what do you call these Eastern monasteries? So they're like, we'll call them the Basilian order. And that's how that was formed.
And remember, I think in Papism, they eventually developed this highly centralized structure where there's like a superior general, there's an abbot, primate, general in Rome.
That's correct.
Whereas the earlier concepts would have been monasteries ruled by their abbots under the bishop. Now, eventually, in some places, you did have, like in the 10th century in France, they did develop the concept that the abbot of Flory was considered the abbot primate, but he still had to work with the rest of the bishops unless he was like a Stavropigil monastery, which they kind of did have some of that stuff. Yeah. They have that in the East too, and such,
But it's nothing like a Roman Catholic order with a superior general that reports to Rome or anything like that. And in fact,
before, even when you had stuff, let's say like, for example, like St. Augustine. St. Augustine, the so-called rule of St. Augustine in another text, St. Augustine considered the house he had where his clergy and other people lived that said the divine office and prayed together. He considered it a monastery.
Yeah.
Right. Now, later, this became an issue about, the Augustinians. Are they really canons or are they monks and such like that? I mean, if you're all living together, you're taking vows, and your poverty, chastity, obedience, you're saying the divine office together, et cetera, and it's based upon an ancient rule. That would have been if you talk to a 4th century father, they'd say, oh, that's a monastery.
Yeah.
All right. But somehow this concept changes where it's not a monastery, partially because I think the Franciscans have this idea that they had to be among the people, I guess.
Yeah.
But technically, they still had a divine office obligation. It was very, very weird. Like in papism, so-called Benedictines, Carthusians, Trappists, they're all considered monks. Okay, whereas in papism, they would say Augustinians. I think there were canons, and they have Augustinian hermits, and then they have Franciscans and Dominicans, which are what considered mendicants.
Mendicants, begging orders. Yeah.
Exactly. And again, that's, as I understand it, really something that came about into the 13th century as time goes on. But again, the earlier, the authentic practice is simply what rule does the monastery that you belong to follow? And in the West, by the time of the Great Schism, most followed the rule of Saint Benedict, unless you're dealing with, let's say, some places in Spain and in Ireland. Although there still was influence there. And even those places which followed the rule of St. Benedict, for example, in England and France and in Italy, they had heavy influence from, let's say, the older Gallican rules. Okay, so because St. Benedict's idea wasn't that he wants to displace or destroy the other rules of the Holy Fathers. He said if there's good things from them, use them. So.
Now, well, the Paleo Paul asks, wouldn't it encourage more Orthodox unity if the Western Rite followed the same fasting schedule as the rest of Eastern Orthodox? Also, participating in Pan-Orthodox Vespers, they aren't Denver area. Okay, in the first part, because we are old calendars, we don't participate in any of these Pan-Orthodox Vespers. That's a modern 20th century thing to encourage Orthodox unity to solve the problem of overlapping jurisdiction. As for the same fasting schedule, I mean, we all fast on Wednesdays and Fridays, and during Great Lent and during Advent, and I mean, it's a pretty similar fasting schedule. Like, I'd be very confused as to what you mean by that, because I would assume even among new calendarists, they're all basically following the same schedule. I don't understand the question.
They'd have to be more specific about it.
Yeah. Rambles asks, which Western saints have been included in Eastern calendars for centuries? I believe St. Ambrose was in the calendar of the East before the schism.
That's an interesting question. There was a service written by one of the 10th century Constantinopolitan patriarchs, a hymn, maybe a small Acoleuthia or something like that, to St. Ambrose, because he was originally maybe patriarch. If you could give me some of the names of the 10th century patriarch, I could tell you which one who wrote this small service, who wrote a few hymns to St. Ambrose, but he did not include them on the calendar, as I understand.
Well, that and the fact that there was no real calendar of the East. There were calendars of local churches, whether it be Greece, Russia.
For example, St. Jerome was not on Byzantine calendars until this beginning, and St. Jerome until St. Nicodemus put them on it at one point.
Yeah, exactly.
There was an attempt to put St. Jerome on the calendar in some parts of Russia, and at one point the patriarch said, "Nothing against St. Jerome, but this is our calendar."
Yeah, so
that may be a good idea, may be a bad idea, but it's like.
Actually, that's an educational point, because the point is, you're right, it is their calendar, and we should have our calendar to venerate our saints, but we weren't there. But if we're there now, there's no good reason except for cross-cultural veneration.
Like St. Patrick, for example. St. Patrick, I think maybe St. Nicodemus, maybe he was the one who put St. Patrick on some Eastern Minologians when he began to write kind of a life into it. That doesn't mean St. Patrick, who wasn't a saint really, until St. Nicodemus decided. This is the argument they say. Well, St. Augustine wasn't on the Eastern calendar until 1795 or whatever. Well, neither was St. Patrick, and St. Jerome, and probably multitudes of others. So that itself is not really an argument for him not being a saint. So.
Okay. Well, let me think here. I don't see any other questions. If anyone else has any more questions, we'll give it another minute or so, or we'll close out. But in any case, it was a good discussion. Next week, I guess we'll be doing the discussion we were going to do last week, but we couldn't do, which was basically finishing up on the whole Monophysite thing, and finally, the one how to destroy 90% of papal arguments with one manuscript, which I think is going to be a very interesting discussion.
Oh, well, I found other manuscripts too.
We'll leave that as a surprise for next week.
All right.
In any case,
how are you doing with the coronavirus?
Well, the coronavirus has put basically the state on lockdown, so now we have a midnight curfew.
We can't leave after 8 p.m. here, so.
Oh well, it'll get to that 8 p.m. over there. Wow, so it'll get there here. But in any case,
I'm feeling kind of sick, so I hope it don't happen. So.
Well, God willing, God protect the bishop. But anyway, since I don't see any other questions, we're just going to say thanks. And maybe after we do next week's show, we'll play around with that video in video thing, so we can just answer some of these gross, usually anti-Orthodox arguments on the fly more easily, and really make use of this thing. So if no one else has any other questions, I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your questions. We're very grateful to have you, and we're very grateful to have Felica Enoch here to help us. With that, Benedicite.
Benedicite.